Good evening, everyone. I'm Cchavi Vashisht. I'm Faculty of Sociology at NICE IS, and I'm an educator at Unacademy. And this is another series, another lecture of GS Paper 1, where you have questions regarding society, and you have to write these answers from a sociological perspective. Though limiting the theories or uh, studies which are related to sociology as a subject, we will be looking at population and associated issues from a societal perspective, right? That is the part of the syllabus. You have to actually adopt certain terms, vocabulary of that subject. Every GS subject, as I have already told you in your previous lectures also, where I have discussed framework for previous year questions, every subject has its own terminology and vocabulary. And you need to adopt that terminology and vocabulary to score your marks. Right. So similarly, we will be looking at this topic, population and associated issues, not from a sociology point of view per se as a subject, option subject, but from a societal perspective, bringing in few sociological perspectives also. Right. The structure of the class is that first we'll be discussing about population and demographic. Oops. One second. Right. First, we'll be discussing about population and demographic studies. What are the contours or what are the broader frameworks that you need to consider while you're studying population and demographic studies? Then, why is there a need to study population? This is part of your GS paper 1, population and associated issues. Why do you really need to understand this topic? Why is it required in your GS syllabus? Why, as a civil administrator, you will be required to understand the population and associated issues? Then there are two theories which have already been asked in your examination, both the Malthusian theory as well as theory of demographic transition. You don't need to go into the details of when the theory came into being, what are the prerequisites, what are the assumptions. Ye sab nahi zarurat hai. But what you really need to understand it is what was the core argument of that theory, right? So same, we will understand the core argument of the theory and we will see that whether this theory has continued to be relevant in the current context or not. Then family planning and family welfare. What do you understand by family planning and family welfare? What is the population policy of India? We will look at the evolution of the population policy of India from the pre-independence time to the post-independence time until date. What has been our population policy? What has been our approach? How we have evolved from it being a medical or a clinical issue to a human rights issue. That is how you understand the current population issues. Right? Population studies issues are considered as human rights issues. So how this thing has evolved in Indian policies and programs as well. And then finally, what are the barriers to family planning? Because of course we know that we are the second most populous country in the world, and there are predictions that we will overtake China in the next few years. So we had a stabilization target of 2045, which we had to further exceed to 2075. So of course we have not been successful in our family planning efforts, despite being the first country in the world to have a family planning program. But we have yet not achieved our desired targets. So, what are the barriers to family planning? Again, this is a topic that we specifically do in the sociology subject, but here we will look at a broader perspective and see how this is a social issue and what are the barriers to this issue. Right. So, let us start with it. First, what is population or demographic studies? Basically, the term is derived from the Latin word demos, and it is also referred to sometimes a Greek word, demos again, which means people, and graphy means describe, demography, right? So therefore, demography is described as the systematic study of population or the science of population. I have before also I have reiterated again and again, any topic that you start, whether it is for GS, whether it is for sociology, whether it is for any other subject, any subject that you start studying, please learn the definition. At least learn the definitions of the topics which are directly mentioned in your syllabus. For example, population. So these, should be completely, their definition should be by heart to you. Earlier, I had taken a lecture on poverty. Then I had taken a lecture on social inequalities. And if you can go back and see it, I always start with the definition. So that is the first and foremost thing that you need to do about any topic mentioned in your syllabus, whether it is GS or your optional subject. Right. Now, when you understand population and when you understand the demography is a systematic study of the population or the science of population. Now, this demography or study of population is of two kinds. One is the formal demography. Formal demography means that you are concerned with the quantitative aspect of the population. Quantitative aspect means you're looking at the size, you're looking at the structure, age-sex structure, you're looking at the characteristics, you're looking at the territorial distribution, right? And whatever changes are occurring within it. For example, in 1950s, what was the size? In 2020s, what is the size? In 1950s, what was the age-sex structure? In 2020s, what is the age-sex structures? So you're looking at the quantitative aspect of it. You're looking at the changes that are occurring within it. But when you study the causes and consequences of it, that becomes part of your social demography, where you're concerned with the study of the underlying causes and determinants of the population phenomena. It helps you explain population phenomena and the changes as well as the changes in them in the context of biological, social, economic, political settings. Now again, when you understand that there is any question with regard to society, you have to understand that this does not have to be written in a very narrow concept. It is not an individual thing that you're looking at, but you're looking at a broader contour, broader perspective, that is social, economic, political. That is how you understand any social issue. May it be caste, may it be class, may it be gender, may it be sex ratio, may it be population, anything that you study. You have to look at from all the perspectives, your biological, social, economic, political. What is the situation all across? In the last part where we'll be discussing the barriers to fertility or birth rate, you will see that even the political factors are important, your economic factors are important, and your social factors are important. So every aspect of it, even the individual micro aspect, is also important. Now, whenever you study population, many of us often mistake that population or the growth of population is just the birth rate. We often mistake that, right? But it is three variables, a sum of three variables. First is the fertility. Second is the mortality. When we will do the demographic transition theory, you will see that the gap between the birth rate and death rate, which increased massively and which is the reason for the population explosion, is because the birth rate was slowing down, but the death rate slowed down much drastically in comparison to the birth rate. So therefore, there was a population explosion. A wider growth of population was visible. The growth rate was very high. So both these factors play a very important role in terms of determining what is the size and growth of population. And the third one is migration. What is migration? In and out migration, immigration, immigration. All these are factors which determine what is the percentage of population which is present in a given territory, right? According to economic survey within India, we have more of in-migration, like within cities, intercity migration. Despite the fact, we also are the country, according to World Bank, the highest remittance receiving country in the world. So all these factors play a very important role in terms of what is the size of population present in the country, what is the growth rate of the population. And that will determine the factors, what we are going to discuss further, that why we need to study the population actually, why we need to study these three variables. Why is it so important? The first factor, which is very important with regard to the study of population, is that your population and economic development go hand in hand. If there is a growth in population, there would be a higher degree of requirement of infrastructure like health, education, and that would then impact the economic development. In the last section, I would discuss with you the Harvard study which was done for India, and it stated that if we are able to control our population and we prioritize the population issues, our GDP would rise by 13% by 2031. 13%. We are aiming for a double-digit growth since 1990s. But if we prioritize our population issue, our GDP would rise to 13% by 2031. This is a study done by Harvard University. So therefore, we understand that population and economic development go hand in hand. When we talk about developed countries, we understand that their birth rate declined, right? This was a study done by UN World Population Statistics. Okay, right now I am using the short form here, but in your final mains examination, please don't use these shortcuts. Does not give a very good impression about you writing an answer. So avoid doing that. In the notes in the class, I do use sometimes, but in your final examination, don't use them. This is also one of the points that we suggest while you improve your writing skills, right? So when we consider the output or the growth rate of developed countries and developing countries, right, we are here considering the birth rate. And the years which were used in that study was 1900 to 1950, 1950 to 60, and 1960 to 70. I know it's quite old, but in comparison wise, you can use the data. And in developed countries, the birth rate was 26, whereas it was almost double in developing countries. Then it further reduced to 22, but it was 43, again a double, almost a double. It was 20, it is 41. That's why we see that developed countries grew at a much faster rate because they were able to control their birth rate, whereas developing countries could not do so. It was always almost a double of what the birth rate was there in the developed countries. So, problem with the birth rate in the developing countries is that it has largely been very static. It has not changed. It has largely been static, and it has been reducing at a very slow pace. And our death rate reduced drastically. That is what we will see in the demographic transition theory when I'll give you the numbers for the death rate. You will see that death rate reduced drastically. But birth rate did not do so. And therefore, we have a population explosion. We are in the third stage of demographic transition, right? So, this increase in population has a direct implication on the economic development of the country. The second issue that you need to consider while studying the population is that what are the problems related to overpopulation? What is overpopulation? First of all, if you have to define, overpopulation is growth of the population is much faster than the rate of its economic development. Your population has increased with a higher degree at a higher growth rate, but your economic development has not increased to a similar pace. This leads to the problems related to overpopulation. If you go back and see the growth of sociology as a subject and why we were so obsessed with studying the population, at that time also in the 18th century, we were obsessed to know the population percentage, that why, this overpopulation, why so much of problem with regard to industrialization, employment, working hours, everything. That is what is the problems which are associated with overpopulation, right? There is unevenness in terms of migration. There is employment opportunities problem. There is health, housing, education. All these things are problem that you study with regard to a higher growth of a population vis-a-vis the economic development. Now, when you talk about the theories, I must tell you that in sociology, when we do it as a part of the optional subject, we do it in a much greater detail, and the initial theories on sociology or initial perspectives on the population was that population is something which adds growth, which adds, is important for any empire. That is how the Roman Empire, Greek Empire considered the population. Even Plato, Aristotle suggested that we need a higher percentage of population so that you can control the economic resources, you can have the control over the defense resources. But what about India? In India also, Arthashastra considered that population is important. And there in the Arthashastra, Kautilya limited the number of population which can be there in a village. Right? So in this way, we were understanding that we require the population, we require that growth number, but that has to be limited also. In this context, we saw the rise of Malthusian theory. Thomas Robert Malthus is an 18th century British economist, and in his book in 1798, an essay on the principle of population, he gave his theory of human population, and he suggested that there is an imbalance or an antagonism between the power of population and the power of earth. The power of population, that is, the human population, increases geometrically, but the food production increases only arithmetically. he said that land is a limiting factor. And therefore, you need to consider that how much a land can bear, how much resources land can provide, and how much resources land can bear to serve the existing population. Population तो multiply हो रही है, geometrically increase हो रही है, but resources, food production नहीं इस तरह increase हो रहे हैं. So under this framework, Malthus argued that eventually we will not be able to produce enough food to sustain ourselves. And therefore, he said that the population power increases more rapidly vis-a-vis the power of Earth. And the solution for this, he suggests, lies in the preventive checks and the positive checks. Either the nature can, create a havoc, for example, flood, famines, disaster, war-like conditions, either nature can provide us, or human beings voluntarily take up these actions. For example, the positive checks. You voluntarily take up the actions of controlling the birth rate. But here what you really need to think about is that whether Malthus' theory has come true. Whatever he predicted, that the world countries would not be able to produce enough food to sustain themselves, whether this has come true or not. And despite the fact that the theory remains very relevant, very important, and that's why we are obsessed with reducing the growth rate in each and every country, this theory has not come true. We have increased our land productivity. We have increased our food productivity. India became self-sufficient in 1980s. Technological revolutions have taken place. White revolution, Greek revolution, honey revolution, ample number of revolutions have taken place. And most importantly, the globalization era, where you can transport goods and services to other countries. So the countries which are, does not have enough resources, you can easily import and export goods and services. So globalization era really, challenged the limiting factor that is land. Now you don't need to have the land, you don't need to have the resources, you can import and export the resources. So Malthusian theory, despite the fact that it is very relevant, very important, and still we study in our subjects, its predictions did not come true. Similarly, we say this for Karl Marx also. His theory remains very relevant, his theory is very important, but his prediction did not come true, right? Whatever he analyzed, that there would be two classes, that did not come true. So you don't see theories, relevance, or you don't study a theory just because it doesn't come true. The concept, the theory is very relevant, is very important for you to understand that population growth will some way or the other impact the food production, will impact the resources available for individuals. But the predictions did not come true, right? Similarly, we have the theory of demographic transition, which is again very important for you to understand in terms of GS paper 1 and GS paper 2 as well. What is the theory of demographic transition? Here you're looking at the changes in the birth rate, death rate, and consequently on the growth rate of the population. Often what people do is, whenever you're studying population, they just focus on the birth rate, as I told you earlier also, and they do not see what is the growth rate, because growth rate will also be implied by your death rate. And this theory suggests that along with the economic development, there would be tendencies of birth rate and death rate are different. C.P. Blacker divided this into 5 types. There are other thinkers also who are associated to it, who have divided them further, who has reduced the division to 3, who has increased the division. So there are many other thinkers, but for your GS paper 1, it is sufficient that you do C.P. Blaker's study, which has divided the population into 5 types. That is high, stationary, early expanding, low, stationary, diminishing. And according to the theory of demographic transition, the population will have to pass through these stages during the course of economic development. Now, this is something which I had picked up from the internet. This has few old data. For example, India is now in the 3rd stage, right? We are in the late expanding stage. Japan is now in the declining stage. So a little bit of change in the examples, but the diagram is very much relevant. In the first stage, where it is a high stationary stage, you will see that the birth rate is high, the death rate is high. Therefore, you have a stable or a slow increase in population. This we were in the pre-independent India time. From 1900s, 1890s to 1920s, we were in the high stationary stage. I must tell you that by 1911 to 1921, this was the only decade which was marked by decline in population growth rate. Now, 2001 to 2011 is another decade which has marked the decline of population. But that time, it was due to war, World War One, and due to a rampant impact of famines and droughts, everything. If you see, that was the era when Gandhiji came into India, and he, laid all these Satyagraha Sabha and everything, only because there were rampant famines, drought conditions, inhabitable conditions, food problems, everything. So, यहाँ पे death rate was very high in India. Therefore, we had a negative growth rate. Then the early expanding stage, where you have a high birth rate and death rate falls rapidly. One second. And death rate falls rapidly. So when all these conditions happened, there was there were famines, there were droughts. Britishers also started taking steps. Gandhiji came to India. He made sure that the farmers' condition were better off. Congress also started taking initiatives to see into the problem of this increasing famines and droughts. So the death rate declined drastically, but the birth rate did not decline at the similar pace. It still continued to be high. Then comes the late expanding stage. This is what we were from 1950s almost to 1990s. Our birth rate started falling and our death rate also started declining further. So this was the period of population explosion, the period between second and the third stage, which we were at from 1930s to 1980s. That is how we consider. Of course, there are many thinkers who take different time span, but largely when we were in the second and the third stage, our population exploded. Then comes the low stationary stage. Our developed countries are in the low stationary stage. We have a lower birth rate and a lower death rate. And finally, the declining stage, where the birth rate is very low and the death rate is also low. Now, we will look at this demographic transition and do the analysis of the birth rate and the death rate and the growth rate of the population. In 1891 to 1901, our birth rate was 46, our death rate was 44. So we had a stable population. Now see, for every decade you can get the birth rate and the death rate. But for the examination, I would not suggest you to learn every decade. Just to choose after every 10 years or after every 20 years. For example, I've chosen 1921 to 31, then a gap of 20 years, 51 to 61. Then a gap of 20 years, 81 to 91, and 2001 to 2011. 1921 to 31, our birth rate was 46 and our death rate was 36 and our growth rate was 1%. 1951 to 61, our birth rate was 42, death rate further declined to a larger extent with a great rapidity, and our growth rate started increasing. It became around 2%. Now this was also the year. Everything is so related to one another. You will see that 1951 to 61, when we will do the evolution of population policy, 1951 to 61 was the first and the second 5-year plan. And this 5-year plan was looking at the population problem more from a medical issue or a clinical approach. And therefore, just by allocating the money, that did not solve the problem of population, and we saw a rise in the growth rate of the population. After this, we started changing our approach From medical approach, we shifted to education extension program. We will do everything in the evolution of the population policy. 1981 to 1991, our birth rate reduced to 29 and our death rate reduced to 9. The population growth rate still continues to be high. 2001 to 2011, 22, 7, and the population growth rate is 2.1. Now here you see that the death rate has been falling since 1920s and the birth rate is high till 1960s, and then it has started declining. By 2045, it is said that India would be the most populous country. Earlier we had the stabilization target of 2045, but that is now shifted and we are no more with this stabilization target. Now, what is the population policy of India? As I told you earlier when the class started, India has the distinction of being the first country in the world to have a fully government-supported family planning program. And this is not something that India decided to do immediately post-independent India time. The genesis for this lies in the pre-independence period. Britishers had introduced population control policy in their country also, in Britain, and they had faced massive reaction. So because they faced a massive reaction about birth control in their own country, here they decided that they would not get involved in this issue. And even the Congress leaders were not very enthusiastic about addressing these problems. But there were scholars and civil servants who studied in England, who understood that there is a problem, and they had studied the Malthus theory, and they understood that India is suffering from the problem of preventive checks and positive checks. Positive checks by the environment, where there were famines, droughts, and other things. So in 1916, P.K. Vattal wrote the book, The Population Problem in India. The title of this class is also derived from this book, The Population Problem in India. Rabindranath Tagore contacted Margaret Sanger in America. She was she was an activist who had set up abortion clinics in America. Then in Mysore state, the first abortion clinic was set up in 1930. Then also a Neo-Malthusian League was set up in Madras in 1929. In 1935, National Planning Committee was set up under Nehru, and All India Women's Conference was set up under Professor D.K. Karve. Now, Professor D.K. Karve, was a very important person in Indian history. She was the first one who had set up the first birth control center. She was also the one who had taken up the issue of rights of women, and later had also become the member of the Family Planning Association in 1949. She had also set up schools, if you remember, in 1916 and 17. You will read this in your history spectrum books, that she had set up schools for women education. So very important person in our Indian history, and was also the member of the Family Planning Association in 1949, which was set up after independence. In 1945, there was another committee which was set up, Health Survey and Development Committee. Government of India had set up in 1945 under the chairmanship of Sir Joseph Bore. Again, a very important committee which laid the foundation and recommended that birth control services need to be set up and provided for the promotion of health of mothers and children. Now here you must understand that when we are talking about increasing the age of marriage also, if you have read it in your current affairs, since last year, since the independence speech of Prime Minister Narendra Modi, where he talked about the increasing of age of women marriage, the focus, even the committee which was set up for this, the Niti Aayog committee which was set up for this, the focus has been that you need to increase the age of marriage for the health of mothers and children, for the mental as well as the physical health of mothers and children. So similarly, this is not something, again I would say, this is not something that has come in the recent times, or it has been something which has been recommended in the recent times. This is the same argument that we have been using since the independence India time, that it is the requirement for the health of mothers and children. Now, what happened post-independent India? Post-independent India, as you know, that whatever you study in the post-independent India, you have to study it from the 5-year plan perspective, because that was the major breakthrough or major way you were framing your policies and programs. Right. So in the first 5-year and second 5-year plan, now again you can recollect that in the demographic transition theory, I told you during the first 5-year plan and the second 5-year plan, our population increased. Why? What we were focusing on or what we were looking at was just a medical issue. We were making financial allocations. For example, in the first 5 year plan, we allocated a sum of 15 lakhs. In the second 5 year plan, we allocated a sum of 2 crores. If you see it per population wise, it is very less. And we had set up a national family planning program in 1952, but we had not set any targets to it. We had said there should be a reduction of birth rate. We said there should be stabilization through family planning clinics, but we did not set a target. And we were looking at it from a more of a medical issue, something which is clinical. In the third 5 year plan, when we realized that, our population has jumped rapidly, our growth rate was 2.1%. And in the third plan, then we replaced this clinical approach with the extension education approach. And we were focusing on the social changes and awareness. Right? What were the social changes that were adopted? For example, increasing the age of marriage, getting education for women, introducing small family laws, and for that we created awareness. A symbol, inverted red triangle, was created to introduce or create the awareness about family planning. Billboards were set up with this. Another slogan which was during that time was "Do ya teen bas." Hum do hamare do was given by in the emergency period time, Indira Gandhi. But during this time, the awareness was "Do ya teen bas." Now, this was the stage when we were looking at family planning or, creating the change from a social change and awareness perspective. But suddenly, again, during the fourth plan, we adopted the camp approach. We were looking at sterilizations. We were looking at how, terminal methods could be used to control the population. And the financial allocations was increased during this time. Now, this model is not completely wrong. This bureaucratic model has been successful in Kerala and Tamil Nadu, but not everywhere. You cannot have a cohesive approach towards population, which is a human rights and a social issue. In 1966, a change had happened that we introduced a full-fledged Department of Family Planning within the Ministry of Health. 1974, the United Nations Population Conference, in this, just change this word, it is Dr. Karan Singh. Dr. Karan Singh gave the slogan, "Development is the best contraceptive." Right? Now again, this is something when I relate population to economic development, then you need to understand that this is something again not new. It has been talked about earlier also. In the fifth plan, what happened? You need to understand during this time, emergency had laid a major setback to the population policy. Sanjay Gandhi's program, a 5-point program, within that, population was part of that program. Coercive measures were used and sterilizations were done forcefully. If you can I can give you the number during 76 to 77. There were around 8.2 million sterilizations. And mostly done on old people, male vasectomies performed. But this was not the correct approach. Coercive measures can never lead to a change in the population policy. Whenever I tell about the successful model of Kerala and Tamil Nadu, I mean to say that there, the bureaucratic approach was successful. People were able to make changes because education was also introduced simultaneously. However, Congress faced a massive backlash after this emergency and this phase of forced sterilization. Even Indira Gandhi, she lost to Raj Narayan, who later became a health minister. And Janata Party introduced certain changes in the population policy, and therefore we had National Population Policy 1976 and 77 that took into account that population is not just a problem which is related to a social issue, but it is related to social, economic, and political aspects. Earlier, we were looking at it from a medical issue, from bringing about a change in the policies. We were looking at that. So we introduced important, relevant points here. And in the 1977 speech, we changed our policy from being a family planning policy to family welfare program. And because of this, we even changed the name of the family planning program within the, Department of Family Planning to Department of Family Welfare. Janata government retained certain provisions of the National Population Policy which were introduced earlier in 1976, in 1977 also. For example, age of marriage, raising the age of marriage from 18 years for girls and 21 for boys. Now we are debating that the girls' age should further be increased to 21 years. Right, taking the population figure of 1971 till the year 2001, all the population which sharing of central resources had to be done in terms of the population. You had to take the population figure of 1971. If you can recollect, again this was changed and now you have increased this number to this year to 2026, right? And then accepting the principle of linking 8% of the central assistance to state plans. This is all there in your IGNOU booklets. IGNOU is the best source for you to learn. If you can recollect all my lectures, if you see my lectures consistently, you're someone who's following my lectures, you will understand that IGNOU is something I consider as a base book. Why? Because very lucid language, very important for your mains examination, and clearly it covers the topic in the broadest possible sense. Right? These are other provisions like including the population education formal school education system. Now in the senior secondary schools, we have population as a subject. Plans to popularize the family planning program and use of all media for this purpose. Participation of voluntary organizations in the implementation of program, improvement of women's education level. Again, education of women is considered as a very important factor where you can bring about a change in the population numbers. This was something which was used as a method in Goa and it became quite successful. Even increasing the age of marriage, when you give the example of other countries, China is someone who had introduced this change and it had implemented the policy of late marriages and therefore less childbirth. So that is something we can also consider, and we have been considering, but we are looking at delaying the age of marriage to the health, mental health and physical health of the mother and the child. Right. So improving the women's education level, and the policy statement also declared that government would give special attention to the necessary research. Now again, if you want to make any development, any technological improvement, you need to have research inputs, right? Technological inputs. Again, this is another separate debate that you need to do as part of GS paper 3, that why India is not technologically very, contributing to the growth, why we have so less of patents. All this is a separate issue with regard to technological issues in India, which you will do as your GS paper 3. Right. Now, when you see this, all these measures were taken in 1977 to 78. The sterilization reduced. Right. It was less than 1 million during that period. 1979, again, Congress came to power and they introduced the population control measures. Now one thing you need to understand, women and conflict have a very close relationship. Now the burden, since the emergency time period, has shifted to a female problem. The terminal methods were used for females. In sociology, we do introduce a demographer for this, Ashish Bose, who has stated that India suffers from the disease called targetous irony. But this is not important for you as such. For you, what you can only remember is that we were too obsessed with our targets. We were too obsessed with our bureaucratic model. And that's why we were not able to control our population. This term is given by Ashish Bose. Right? We do this in much greater detail in our sociology optional course. But here for you, this much is enough. In 1994, we had the third International Conference on Population, which was held in Cairo. Here, approach changed. Now we had a focus where a program of action was adopted, and India also became part of this program of action. Now they were focusing on the reproductive health of child and mother, education of girls, health of the women, safe, affordable methods. All this were being used for reproductive control. Then in 1994, we had a committee on population, which was led by Karuna Karan. And we also set up an expert group committee under Swaminathan. And this was the committee which laid the foundation for, or laid the draft for the National Population Policy 2000. Right. Again, this committee and the expert group also recommended that we must have a comprehensive approach towards the population problem. And we have to cure the symptom. We have to cure the problem and not look at the population just as numbers. We have to look at it from the broader perspective, from the socioeconomic perspective, and not make it a bureaucratic model. We have to adopt or bring in people so that there can be a positive contribution towards bringing the population numbers to a lower level. So now the draft talked about, which was created by the expert group under Swaminathan, about a pro-people, pro-women approach, and therefore we had a national population policy which was focusing on all these things, so focusing on the age of marriage, focusing on universalization of education, focusing on poverty, focusing on numbers. Numbers were given, for example, and this is something which often comes in UGC NET examination also, that what were our targets for the population policy 2000, right? Maternal mortality rate had to be reduced to 100. TFR had to be brought to 2.1. There should be involvement of PRIs and other institutions, voluntary institutions. So again, you were talking at a comprehensive approach towards the population policy. The national population policy was talking about all these things, about strengthening the community health centers, primary health centers, sub-centers, augmenting the skill of health personnel and healthcare providers, bring out convergence in the implementation of related social sector program to make family planning or family welfare program people-centered, and integrated package of essential services at village and household levels. With all these efforts in 2001 to 2011, it was the first decade, except I told you in 1911 to 21, because the reasons were different then, that the absolute increase in population over the 10 period has been less than the previous decade. It is not being said that there has not been an increase, but the absolute increase in comparison to the previous decade was less, and the percentage growth or decadal growth rate recorded a decline. Now, all these policies, all these measures are there. But still, we are the highest, second highest technically, but we will overtake China very soon. We are the second highest country with our population of almost 1.32 billion. And because of this, we understand that the population approach that we have adopted, the policy approach that we had adopted, was a vertical approach, top to bottom. Despite realizing that the vertical approach to solve the population problem is not going to help us, still we continue to adopt that. So what are the barriers to family planning? We had population program. We were the first country. But what are the barriers? The first barrier that you need to understand is the high fertility rate and the death rate. And why do we have that? In sociology, we do this in a much greater detail, but here I can just give you a head start to this topic and you can further read this topic, that it is a function of socioeconomic conditions, right? For example, there is a universality of marriage institution in India. Everyone ultimately will be getting married. Basically, the term which is associated to this is known as population momentum. What does this mean? That India's population will grow inevitably because we have a higher percentage of the young population. According to United Nations, they had conducted a study. India has 67% of the population of India is in the bracket of 15 to 64 years. So we have a younger population who would eventually lead to increase in population. So that is the first thing that you need to understand, that when you are understanding family planning, despite all the measures, we have a population momentum which will lead to an increase in the population growth, right? Then there are other factors, the social and economic factors that I was talking about. For example, there is a universality of the marriage institution. There is son meta preference. Now, this is something you must have read in your economic surveys earlier. But if you have not, I would suggest you please go back and read about the son meta preference, where India has a priority or the preference for son. And because of that, you continue to have children until and unless you have the desired number of sons in your family, or just one son in your family. So that is also one factor, that we have a higher growth rate or the fertility rate. Another very important factor which we had discussed in our Unacademy lecture also, that the religious beliefs, except Buddhism, all religions glorify childbirth. This is an issue which is prevalent, and we consider children as the gifts of God, and therefore you don't go for abortions. In America also, this is the major debate during the election time, that who will support the abortion policies and who will not. So still you have this attitude that children are the gift of God, and you don't want to rethink on the abortion or taking preventive actions. Right. Then economic structure. If you have an agriculture or a sector which involves more labor, there you would tend to have a high fertility rate vis-a-vis the ones, for example, services sector where you don't need much labor, or the manufacturing sector where you have technology which can replace the labor. Right. So all these factors, again, this is something we do in a greater detail in the optional course, but just to give you a head start here and to introduce you to the certain changes, that these are the social and economic factors that contribute to the higher fertility rate and the birth rate. Another important factor is that the methods used in family planning also pose problems. Now, why are there problems in terms of methods? Getting yourself operated, undergoing the sterilization methods is always not acceptable to people. There are possible side effects to it, and therefore people are not willing to undergo that treatment. Then availability of supplies. For example, India has a scheme for home delivery of contraceptives by the ASHA workers, but how easily are they available? Are people open enough to accept this as a way to control their population or the growth rate? All these things are important that you need to understand before you suggest that the methods for family planning have been successful or not. Even the budget that we have allocated to the population control or to this is only 4% of the national health mission. And within this, most of it, almost around 80% of it, is contributed to the terminal methods. Otherwise, the effort should be on creating education, on creating information. The approach that we suggest for controlling the population is IEC. Information, education, communication. Right? Then the NFHS 4 talks about the missing men in the population problem. I told you since the time of emergency, this became a female problem. So NFHS 4 talks about how they are missing men because vasectomies performed, sterilizations performed on male is only 1.9% and rest is all female. Our birth rate, the total fertility rate, has regional and state variations. Few states are higher, a few states are lower. And then there is problem of forced sterilizations also. For example, the Chhattisgarh case you can refer to, where Supreme Court had also given a judgment on Ramakant Rai case. That is very important for you to understand how family planning we are approaching towards family planning. Now, from the GS perspective, I am just going to state few of the schemes that you can write it down for your conclusion part, or whenever it is asked that how we are looking at the family planning now. There are few schemes. For example, we have Mission Parivar Vikas. This Mission Parivar Vikas is being implemented in the 7 states. It is not across all the country, but it is there in 7 states, which has a higher fertility, total fertility rate. Then we have Jan Sankhya Sthirta Kosh. This Jan Sankhya Sthirta Kosh, within this we have 2 schemes. The first one is the Santushti strategy. Within this, you are looking at the sterilization efforts, and this has been undertaken under the PPP approach. And then we have Prerna strategy. Now, Prerna strategy is focusing on increasing the age of marriage and spacing between the childbirth. So these are the 2 schemes which are under the Sankhya Sthirta Kosh. Right? Then we have scheme for home delivery of contraceptives by the ASHA workers. We also have National Family Planning Indemnity Scheme. So all these are schemes that Indian government is taking to control the population problem. But still, we are 1/6 of the world population, 1.32 billion. Globally, now family planning is considered as a human right issue. And what we need to focus on is that we need to adopt methods where you can increase the education of women. That is the most relevant and most important method that you can introduce. But with that, you have to also increase the decision-making power of a woman. Sometimes women are educated, but they don't have the decision making power. They cannot decide whether they have to give birth to a child or not. So that decision making power needs to be given to women. And this you can see that within India, women are not represented in the political institutions. They're not given the right. The head of the households are mostly male members. So bringing a shift to the women's decision making power, we can bring a shift to the family planning process also. Second important factor is that there are predictions, almost two-thirds of the population projections, which has stated that if we increase the age of marriage, we will be able to control the population of the country. I told you since last year, this debate has revived again with regard to the age of marriage. But now we are looking at the increasing the age of marriage from a health perspective. But if we are able to increase the age of marriage, our population would also be controlled. And that is a very important factor that we need to consider. And we need to bring about a policy to increase the age of marriage. Right. And again, we can adopt literacy model, which is there in Goa. We can adopt the education model, which is there in Kerala and Tamil Nadu. We can adopt the late marriages model, which is there in China. All these models can help you, increase your approach, a comprehensive approach towards the family planning, and control the population so that we can achieve our stabilization targets. Right. So this was all about population problem of India. We again have these. This was basically more of population and the associated issues with regard to the number. Right. Within associated issues, few more issues are there. For example, sex ratio and child sex ratio is very important topic that you need to cover up. Then aged population, again a question which has already appeared in your UPSC examination and can be further predicted also for your further exams. So all these are issues. If I get time, I will bring out a second part to this series of population and associated issues, and we will study these issues apart from other issues that we can study within the population and associated issues topic. Right. So that was all. And in case you go on the Unacademy platform, you can avail the nice IAS code with the 10% discount you will get on the subscription charges for any of the course that you adopt in Unacademy. So hope you understood the topic, and I'm looking forward to further interactions with you. Thank you so much for joining in.